Yeah, so today I wanted to talk about things I've been wrong about in the application security space. As I'll talk a little bit more about, I'm at a point now where I have to say that these opinions don't necessarily reflect those of my employer. Recently, Coalfire acquired Denver in June of this year, which I'm very excited about. I think all our team's very excited about. But this is something I couldn't really say at Denver, with being a closely held private company, with like two business partners. It was harder to separate my opinion from what would be perceived as a corporate pronouncement. So, if I go off on some kind of crazy Nazi rant, Sheridan can't be like, Dan Cornell, I hadn't really heard of that guy, but now I think that is important to say is. Again, I'm speaking as Dan Cornell, as myself here, not as a representative of Coalfire. In fact, I don't actually even think that they know I'm here. Well, shit. Hopefully from the quality of my slides, though, everybody can believe that the marketing department has had no hand whatsoever in the development of this talk. A little bit of background, and like one thing I love about LastCon is there's a lot of friendly faces. Again, know a lot of folks here, and that's fantastic. But for folks that don't necessarily know me, I was one of the founders and the CTO of Denim Group back at the end of 2001. And we were, Denim Group was an OWASP participant since the first OWASP AppSec, the one that was at that university in New Jersey. I think it was 2003. So in the application security space for a long time, I've had the opportunity to speak at a lot of OWASP events, at RSA, at the Black Hat CISO Forum, TEDx. I'm really excited. I'm honored to have the opportunity to give this keynote today at LastCon, because again, LastCon is a conference that I have always enjoyed participating in. And after the acquisition of Denim Group by Coalfire, now I'm the vice president of product strategy at Coalfire, so still actively engaged. And that's, I think, an important thing to note. I'm still working. I'm still doing application security stuff, helping organizations solve hard application security problems. This isn't some kind of a goodbye cruel world talk about kind of a mic drop exiting the application security space. But I do find myself at a situation after running Denim Group for 20 years and now going through this transition. When you work on something for 20 years, you accomplish an important goal. It's reasonable to have some time for reflection. Both to look at what we did as a team, as well as what I did as an individual and how that contributed to it. And people love to talk about what went right. And there's, I think this is an XKCD cartoon that I've cribbed, where you get to a point and you look back and say, like, oh, okay, look at these waypoints along the way that have this like straight line of, where I started to where I'm at right now, and you can, push a narrative back on what happened. But that's not necessarily the way, that doesn't reflect reality. It's not necessarily that. In no circumstance that I've ever seen does that actually reflect reality. And there's a lot less discussion of what didn't go well along the way, and there's a lot less discussion of mistakes. But, and I think there's a problem with that, because you end up with these like articles of like, here's the 5 things that Steve Jobs did, to make him successful. Like, well, number one, like statistically speaking, I feel very comfortable saying that the next Steve Jobs is not in this room right now, right? But also, again, going back and looking only at the things that were successful, like that, that doesn't necessarily bring in the context of why was this successful? Would this have been successful in another area? What mistakes led up to getting to this success or to doing things better? And I've always tried to take the attitude of, not win or lose, right? Where, hey, we've got something that we're doing and it's either going to turn out great or it's going to turn out wrong, right? I try to take the view of win or learn, right? And so either you win and you get what you want, which is great. I mean, that's why you wanted it in the first place. But if you find out that you're wrong or you made mistakes, it's important to reflect on those. And as another thing, if you're always right or never finding out that you're wrong, then you're probably not taking enough risks. You're probably being too comfortable. And so, I've always tried to make mistakes, but always try to make different and better mistakes. And that's one of the things that I knew from running a company. And I'm sure for those of you that run teams, just like crazy stuff happens, right? Like having employees, just like wacky stuff happens. You've got clients that you're working with, and just like crazy things happen. And it seems like always, when looking at running teams and looking at those types of things, there's always this chaos, right? Because things are going wrong because I made bad decisions, people underneath me made bad decisions, whatever that might be. That's just kind of the nature of the world, right? Is nothing ever works right. But something that I have always tried to do is to learn from those mistakes and to make new and more interesting mistakes, with the new opportunities that are presented to me. And so that's kind of the spirit of, the kind of like thoughts that I put together today. Here's the great Rumsfeld quote about like known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, right? I suppose that's technically correct, or we could like draw that out in a formal proof or something like that, which is fantastic. But when I think about this, it's more the Mark Twain quote of, it's not like the things that you don't know aren't the ones that are necessarily going to be the most damaging, right? And that's the case in application security. We're trying to learn, right? There's unknown things that we're trying to understand. What's the security state of this application? Does this authentication authorization behave the way that we think it does, right? If you don't know and you're asking questions, like that's good, because that means that you've got space to progress into. The things that really hurt you are the assumptions that you've made or the things that you are convinced are true, but that actually aren't, because then that causes you to behave in ways that are counter to ultimately being successful. And so if you're assuming like, yeah, I know that our authentication routines are secure, right? Like I know that we've got input validation across the application, right? It's those assumptions that you make where you're certain of things, where you don't have curiosity or you're not open to any doubt, is where you run into problems. And so I want to talk about some things in the application security space that I used to think were correct, but that I no longer do. And then probably more importantly, I want to look at some reasons why I think I was wrong. And so thing number one, and this is the big one, is right, thinking that organizations are going to do application security because it's the right thing to do, right? So audience participation time. All things being equal, who would rather be more secure versus less secure? Right? Who wants more secure? Of course, who wants less secure? Right? Right. So obviously, who wouldn't want to be more secure, right? Like that is, that's a better thing, right? But the hinge there is that all things being equal, and we'll talk about that. The challenge is, I think that a lot of the talk around application security has been almost a good hygiene kind of a talk, right? Like everyone should shower once per day, right? But you don't have to shower once per day, right? Anyone who's been to DEF CON will presumably agree with me, right? It is a global good if you shower once per day, but there's not a requirement, right? Nobody can make you shower once per day. And that's a real challenge that I think that I've heard. I know with a lot of arguments that I've made with organizations, hey, why should we care about application and software security, right? Why should we take action on this? I'm like, well, you don't want to be like not secure. You don't have vulnerabilities in your code, do you? Right? And the answer, of course, is, well, of course I don't, but that's not really a justification. These good hygiene arguments for security, I don't think are super effective or compelling. Building security in it's great advice on how to run a software security program, right? Ultimately, I think you end up with better security. You get it earlier in the process. Long term, it's going to be cheaper. Like building security in is great advice on how to run a software security program, but it's terrible advice on why to run a software security program. And I found that myself I made far too many arguments that assumed that everybody would want to have a certain level of security and would be willing to exchange sufficient resources for that. I'd like to note that I called, during that, for this slide, I'm calling it software security rather than application security in honor of Dr. Gary McGraw. He's always made a point, software versus app security. And this goes back, I saw this behavior myself this kind of a classic entrepreneurial mistake, right? Of like, hey, I want something, and think of how much money I'll make if the world behaves the way that I want them to, right? Prior to Denim Group, I ran another startup called Brand Defense, right? And it was a total failure. We rammed it in the ground at high speed. And what we did at Brand Defense is we went out and found copyright and trademark violations, right? So organizations have copyrighted materials, they trademark for branding purposes. We would go out and find those violations, and we could generate all the DMCA takedown paperwork, right? And I think everybody would agree copyright and trademark infringement is bad, right? Right? I mean, for the most part, there's some EFF arguments and whatnot on the margins, but in general, you shouldn't steal people's copyrighted material. You should not misuse their trademarks. Hopefully, that's something that we can largely agree on. But what we found was we were solving a problem that the organization didn't know they had, right? And it was a problem they were going to have to solve with budget that they hadn't allocated. And most importantly, it was a problem that they were going to have to solve with people power, right? Like they were going to have to put employees or staff on solving this problem, right? And so while we said like, hey, you don't want copyright and trademark violations, and everybody would say like, you're correct, I don't want infringements of our trademarks and copyrights, right? But then we said, cool, for the low price of whatever we're charging plus this, you can solve that. And like, okay, well that's not a trade-off that we're super interested in making. And and so we had a meeting with our investors, and we said, hey, we've identified the 500 companies that we think are most applicable to this service. We've got the name of the person to talk to it, like 480 of them. We've talked to 450 of these people. We've run 75 live demos where we find these violations and generate the paperwork. And we have one paying customer, and their CFO was our CFO at my first startup. And Graham Weston, who's one of our investors, was one of the original investors in Rackspace. Super great guy. Sits and he's thoughtful for a minute, and he says, "I'm not sure the world is ready for what we're doing, for what we're doing here." And that was a nice way of saying that we had an idea that wasn't destined to work out, so we returned money to the investors and whatnot. And it turns out like application security in a lot of cases is the same way, right? Like everybody would prefer to be secure, right? Nobody wants to like have security vulnerabilities, but those development organizations also have to deliver software on time and on budget. And so in a lot of cases, other priorities take precedence, because it's not just a case of like, do you want secure applications or not? It's a question of what resources are you going to allocate to security that then can't be allocated in other areas. And I think that's something that that broadly the app security industry for a long time failed to recognize. And I know that that's something that fed into my thinking as well. And that made me a less effective communicator, me a less effective ambassador for the idea of applications and software security. Because again, allocating resources in one place means they can't be used in another. This is also true for vulnerability remediation, right? Fixing vulnerabilities, in my head or in my thinking for a long time, it's like, well, you got these vulnerabilities, you got to fix them because security is the most important thing. But the problem is that fixing vulnerabilities isn't free. Those cost story points that have to be allocated to security and are thereby not allocated to non-security related bugs that are impacting customer experience, performance enhancements, non-security technical debt, and new features, right? Like the drug that all product teams are addicted to is new features, right? And those are the ones that are out, again, driving new business. And I think that I avoided this to a large degree, but I think the industry, in a lot of cases, you meet these security curmudgeons, right, where they have this perception that developers don't care about security. I remember giving a talk at an ISSA meeting, and somebody in the back said, like, oh, if those stupid developers would just care about security, like all this would be like not a problem. And I was like, you are fun at parties, sir. Like this is, I don't have that perception, right? But I think I at least didn't take it to that extreme, but I think other folks in the security space do, whereas there's this perception that the developers don't care about security, organizations don't care about security, right? But again, it's important to understand these trade-offs. I had a very good lesson in this, not specifically security related, but there's a woman named Carla that runs the success team for ThreadFix, like one of the dev teams for our ThreadFix platform, and she's tremendous. She just won a Globee 2021 Women in Business in the Professions World Award, which is a great honor for her. I mean, reflects the just tremendous things that she's done in her career. She started as an intern, is now a team lead. Right, but one of the best things about her is that she's pragmatic, right? And so we have these conversations where I'm like, hey Carla, can I get an engineer to look into this thing that I'm interested in just for a little bit? Hey Carla, can I borrow an engineer for a while? I need to get some estimates on this stuff. Hey Carla, can I borrow an engineer to prototype this thing that I need a little help on? And she gives me a look that at the same time indicates that she is the most patient individual on the entire earth, and that I'm the stupidest human that she's ever met in her entire life, right? Because her question is like, cool, where are we moving the release date to? I'm like, well, we can't move the release date. And she's like, right, then we can't task engineers to do the stuff that you want them to do. They're gonna do the stuff that I have them tasked to do, right? And that's, I think, a critical thing. There's 24 hours in the day. People can only work so much. And doing one thing means that you can't do another, right? Not just security related. And that's something that I've failed to understand a lot, where I was always assuming, well, let's just layer on like one more security task, or why can't we put this type of analysis in the CI/CD pipeline? It's like, well, I mean, the automation runs for free, but then somebody's got to own what comes out on the other end of that. Like somebody's got to triage the false positives, right? And so that's a challenge that I, for a long time, failed to understand, is these security tasks consume resources, and those resources can't be used somewhere else. And so this blanket argument of like, hey, everybody should just do application security doesn't work really well. So why do companies do application security, right? I think you need to look at incentives, right? This is capitalism that we live in. Firms don't do things just because, right? Firms do things because they expect to get a return on an investment of those resources. And that's something, again, that eluded my perspective for a long time. And so one question I would ask folks, if you were a software dev team manager, right, or a product group manager, and you had two dev teams working for you, one that wrote perfectly secure code, but always just blew through deadlines and could not get anything out even close to being on time, and you had another team that wrote bad code, but always hit their deadlines every day, all day. Like, which dev team would you want building out your product, right? We're in a security conference right now. Like, who wants the perfectly secure team that can't hit a deadline? A couple folks. Who wants the team that gets stuff done, but leaves a bunch of technical debt in their wake? Right? Yeah, if you ask this question at a non-security conference, there would be zero hands up for that first team, right? And that's something, again, that I've failed to understand for a long time, but I think is really critical, is to understand what is the incentive that organizations have to do application security stuff. Is it breaches? Breaches cause pain, and pain causes changes in behavior, right? And so what we've seen is breaches cause, at least temporarily, changes in organizations' behavior, right? This doesn't necessarily last forever, right? But it is an impetus for behavior changes in a number of organizations. Right? Compliance, right? Like one of the first kind of sea changes I saw in the application security industry is when the PCI DSS added in, like, hey, you need to train developers on security topics, and you need to either be doing application testing, or you need to have a WAF in place, right? That changed behavior, right? And why did it change behavior? It changed behavior because there was the threat of, if you don't do these things, if your PCI auditor won't sign off on your practices, you're going to lose the ability to take credit card transactions, right? And again, you might survive a breach, right? Like, and as we've seen, most organizations do. It doesn't have a long-term impact on the stock price, right? Organizations survive breaches. They don't survive not being able to take money, right? And so again, as these compliance requirements get layered in, what we've seen explicitly with like PCI and FedRAMP, implied in other compliance regimes, and we see that changes organizations' behavior, right? Similar to this, regulations. Who here is big fans of software bills of material? Everybody? Great. Really, really cool concept. You see the talk in the executive order that came out of the Biden administration talking about these things. OWASP with Steve Springett's dependency track, fantastic OWASP tool to help you track these software bills and materials. And so everybody here should either be getting ready, depending on your role, to either ask for software bills and materials from your suppliers or to provide them to your customers, right? And honestly, I think as an industry, like literally this is the least we can do, right? Hey, you sold me some software, cool, what's in the software, right? If you get like the two shoulder salute and I'm like, that's a bad answer, right? And that's, it's kind of like the story about I think it was the Rolling Stone, no, it was a Van Halen, where they had the concert writer that said, like, you have to, no, or only green M&Ms or no brown M&Ms or whatever it is, right? And that was a check though, right? To go in and see, well, hey, did they read the writer? No, they've got normal bag of M&Ms. Okay, well, did they do all the other stuff that they needed to do for the rigging and the stage and to be able to handle loads and stuff like that? And so it's a tell, right? So if you're looking at an organization and you ask, hey, can you provide a software bill of materials? And they say like that's a good indicator. Like what practices do they have in place if they can't even answer these simple questions for us? Another huge thing has been customer pressure. And I actually first had this realization at LastCon in the expo area. I can't remember what year, it was a number of years ago. But I first had this realization where, from talking to different folks, the biggest impetus for a lot of organizations, where they, outside of financial services, where they get like directly financially impacted by, on a consistent basis, by having security vulnerabilities, but outside of the financial services where there's kind of a direct and immediate financial impact, the biggest push that we've seen for organizations to adopt security practices have been when their customers have come to them and said, we're not going to buy from you unless you can explain that you have, or unless you can communicate or convince us that you have a certain level of security with the products that you're selling to us, right? Purchasers have power, and certainly leading up to an initial sale, right? And it's interesting over time, I've seen a lot of organizations that didn't care about security all of a sudden start to care about security because they have these requirements. And actually, one of the things that we do when organizations come to us and say like, hey, we need an application pen test or whatever the request is, one of our questions is like, why are you doing this, right? Is it that you've had a breach? Is it that you have a new CTO and the mandate is we're doing new security stuff? And a lot of times the answer comes back like, well, to win this contract, we have to demonstrate that we've done security testing to a certain level. Great. I mean, that's a great reason because it gets people to do stuff. And so one of the questions we then ask is, well, in order for us to scope this, right, to understand like what level of rigor you're trying to apply, can you send us the contract language that you're being bound to? And that way we can make sure that what we do is going to fulfill that contract language. Like I can identify the customers, right, by the contract language, where people be like, oh, here's the text that we have to meet. I'm like, oh, that's that one airline. And they're like, well, how do you know that? I'm like, because I've seen it, because I've seen it from XYZ other folks, right? Or hey, here it is. Oh, that's that retailer. And well, how'd you know that? I'm like, well, because I've seen this contract language before. It was, this is how they run their risk management program. And a great thing about this is that, as a global benefit, if every organization starts doing this, right, to their suppliers, then everyone has to start doing it for their customers, right? Because everybody buys stuff and sells stuff. And when you get a sufficient enough percentage of the population that are requiring these as table stakes for a purchase, well, then all of a sudden everybody is doing application security work, right? Is that right? Is that the ideal way to get people to undertake application security programs? No, right? But we live in a world where you have to deal with these trade-offs, and so I think it's really important to understand why do organizations undertake these activities, right? Because in understanding that and in moving beyond this good hygiene argument for application security, that puts us as security professionals in a situation where we can communicate more effectively about the incentives and the trade-offs, and where we can better implement the will, right, or what is going to be most valuable in our organizations. Thing number two, for a long time, I thought that every developer should be a security expert, and that the way to achieve this is to teach everyone general security principles, right? The problem is this led to an over-focus on instructor-led training, which is comparatively expensive versus other options. Lots of discussions about theory, authentication, authorization, crypto constructs and whatnot, which for a lot of engineers is boring. It's not applicable to what they're doing. Not enough focus on specific code examples, which makes the training less immediately actionable. And this was an interesting thing that I learned, code examples in languages and frameworks that the development teams aren't using, because that's potentially distracting and confusing. And so, again, I've run a lot of instructor-led training, and over time, made that a lot better by getting feedback from the individuals taking courses, from the organizations that are purchasing these courses. Learned a lot about how to more effectively educate these developers so that they can go out into the world and be more effective. And it's a challenge. Like, I came up through a liberal arts education. I went to a Jesuit high school, went to Trinity University in San Antonio, liberal arts, where the focus is on teaching you, not teaching you things, but teaching you how to learn, right? And that kind of flywheel of lifelong learning, which is a great thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, right? But what we find is that liberal arts education is great, but developer security training is vocational training, right? It needs to be much more immediately applicable so that they can take away from that class, and go out and be more effective immediately in their jobs, right? So what do developers really need? Enough security knowledge to do their job well. And this is going to vary. If you're looking at senior engineers, if you're looking at people that are in security champions roles, they are going to need to have that more liberal arts approach to security education for themselves. That's what you require at senior levels. That's what you require of people that are going to be kind of central to driving programs. But for your rank and file developer, they don't necessarily need that extensive knowledge, right? Unless it's a specific learning area or interest area for them, there's not a lot of value in really drilling in at that level. They need to know, okay, what are the features I need to turn on and off? Why am I doing that? Great. What are code examples of how I need to be doing this? Why is that important? And I see OWASP has created some really good resources around these with the OWASP cheat sheets, the web security versus the web security testing guide, which is also a great document, but again targeted a different audience. That more kind of like bite-size education that is very specific, or as specific as possible, like that moves the needle for the individual engineer a lot more quickly than more broad-based kind of skills or conceptual training, right? And that was something I had to learn over time. Again, getting feedback from people in classes that are like, why are you showing me .NET examples? I'm a Java developer. I'm like, well, just ignore them. And they're like, why do we even have the slides in there? I'm like, an excellent point, right? Or like, hey, why do you have Java examples? I'm a .NET developer. I'm like, well, you can just Google how to, what that looks like in .NET. And they're like, well, what do I have you for, trainer? So that's, again, something that I learned along the way. Thing number 3, I thought, and this was really pernicious, but it's, hey, if you're not a developer, you ain't shit, right? And I see this. I have this fight on Twitter once every 4 to 6 months with a couple of people that I largely respect in other areas. But I'm a Java developer by background, right? And I think that Java developers can do anything, right? So you should see some UI UX designed by Java developers, right? That's and you should see documentation written by Java developers, right? Fantastic. But that was a problem that I had is, I came from this background. I say, I'm a Java developer. I'm upstream of all these other tasks because I can write in English. Clearly I can write documentation because I can make UI elements show up on the page. Clearly now I'm a UI designer, right? And, and that's a real problem. It was a real problem for me because it shaped who we hired into the organization. And made that narrower in a lot of cases, right? And it affected the way that we consulted with organizations and whatnot. And so this was something that I really had to get over because the reality is in the security industry, again, programming skills are huge, right? And learn to code is broadly good advice. No one's going to be sad, I don't think, that they learn to code, except for every professional programmer on really dark days when deadlines are coming up. But again, from a professional skills standpoint, I'm not saying that being able to code is not a huge asset. But in this app security space, like there's plenty of work to go around, right? And it doesn't all have to be done by Java developers, right? We need people that specialize in a variety of skill sets, to build out comprehensive security programs. And again, like we need people to do auditors, to do GRC, to do UI, UX. We need project managers, we need product managers, we need documentation writers. There's a lot of things that go into a successful security program that aren't just writing Java code, or aren't just scripting in Python or writing Go or whatever the cool kid language is for the day. And that's something that, again, it took me a long time for me to, for me to realize. And that made me less effective in building and tasking and running teams because of that misperception. Thing number 4 is I always thought that certifications were stupid, right? And we used to have to have Microsoft certifications for our partnership, like to get our free MSDN licenses or whatever. And so we'd send people to take the different tests, and 70% was the passing score. And if you got over 70%, we made fun of the person that took the test because they studied too hard, right? Like it was viewed as like, hey, we have to have this, so we will do the barest minimum to get this, to get these certifications. And I didn't view that as something that was valuable. And one of my business partners, John Dixon, when the CSSLP certification came out, he said, like, hey, Dan, you might want to consider getting this. And I was like, that's, I don't need to do that. By the way, John Dixon got his CISSP so long ago, his cert numbers in Roman numerals, right? I just wish John were here to hear me say that, so I'm gonna have to send him this slide when I finish up, right? But I scoffed at the idea, right? And for me, that was probably correct, right? Like I was in a position where I didn't need certifications, right? I mean, I had a bachelor's degree in computer science with a totally awesome minor in math, right? I had a previous company exit before we started Denim Group. I was the founder, I had the CTO title. Like nobody's coming to me and saying like, hey, well, I know you're the founder and the CTO, but do you have your Security Plus certification, right? Like for a person in my position, that was not, the incremental value of that was not high. But my problem was I thought because they weren't important for me or for a person in my position, that they weren't important for anyone else, right? And I certainly would agree and vehemently argue that as an industry, we need to reevaluate the way that we do hiring and our kind of hiring pipelines and things like that. There's a lot of work that can be done there to bring more folks in who can all contribute. But as an individual, like trying to make a decision, should I get a certification or not? Like there are folks where that is going to be much more valuable for their career. Folks without degrees, right, who need a way to demonstrate some level of expertise to get past the gatekeepers in the corporate hiring process. Certifications do have a lot to offer for those folks. And so looking back, my dismissive attitude was not helpful, right? It was reflective of my bias that I had because of my position, that I flipped around and assumed, well, everybody else is in the, is in the same situation, right? Or should have the same perception or values that I did. So why was I wrong about all this stuff? I don't know if folks read The Onion. This is kind of an old Onion article, right? But the tow truck driver has a great idea for a tow truck movie, right? The reason that I was wrong about all this stuff is because I assumed that everybody was like me. I assumed that others had a background like me and that they would think like me, right? That they valued the same things, that they had the same success criteria for their projects, for their career. All right, I was real focused on the trees that were right in front of me, and it caused me to miss the to miss that view of the forest, and that's a problem. That kind of thinking where you're only looking from your own perspective, is really damaging. I know it's something that made me less effective as a communicator. It made me less effective, as a person helping organizations to address application security issues. It made me a less effective team leader, and again, it's something that I've had to look to correct. So if we look back, right, like I think that application security is important. Oh, and by the way, I'm selling it, right? So therefore, every organization should totally think it's super important as well, right? Like that type of thinking. Well, I'm an expert in application security. Everybody else probably ought to be an expert too, right? I'm a Java developer and I'm awesome. So therefore, if you're not a developer, then you're not useful. And I'm too cool for certifications, so therefore nobody should value those, right? They're a tool that doesn't have any application. Like that's the type of thinking that I had that was not, it was deeply unhelpful. And I'm not unique. I see a lot of folks in the security space. A lot of folks in the security industry are smart. How many people were smart growing up? Right? Either with grades or with, well, that person's smart, but like if they applied themselves, they would, right? There's a lot of people in the security industry who are even worse, clever, right? And I think a lot of folks feel like they need to be right, right? And and again, this is something that plagued me for a long time and continues to plague me. So I think that it's important to look at like how do we identify situations where we're wrong, right? You got to be able to put yourself in, from other stakeholders' point of views because they might not value certain parts of the outcome in the way that you do, right? You got to seek out viewpoints other than your own. You can't be in your own just like self-echo chamber or talking to folks that think exactly like you do. And you've really got to process negative feedback, and that's something that's really hard to do. I am exceptional at justification, right? And so I'll hear like feedback that reinforces what I think, and I'm like, that person's smart, that person's smart, that person's smart, that person's smart. Then I'll hear something that doesn't agree with me, right? And I'll be like, well, that person doesn't know what they're talking about, or like, well, that person doesn't understand this problem in the way that I do, right? So that's a real challenge, is to take that negative feedback or feedback that goes against what your kind of preconceived notion and find a way to digest that and change your opinion based on that. It's something I do a little bit of work, kind of mentoring startups and things like that. And one of the things I tell them over and over again is like, go find people that disagree with you. Go find people who think your idea is stupid, right? Because your parents are going to tell you your idea is great. And your spouse is going to tell you your idea is great. And your friends are going to tell you your idea is great, right? You need to find people that will actually tell you the truth, because unless you address that truth, you're going to put yourself in a situation where you're not going to be as successful, right? And so, OWASP has done some things that I think are really great in support of this. You're bringing in different viewpoints. OWASP support for the women in AppSec, I think, is great. Again, to bring folks that aren't necessarily, ratio-wise, aren't found in population AppSec folks the way that others are. I love what OWASP does, where there are lower membership fees for folks, for supporters coming out of the developing world to get different perspectives there. Fantastic stuff. And so I'll close on an amusing, what I find to be an amusing anecdote. I was at the AppSec in Belfast a couple of years ago, and I was given a talk. And I don't know if for folks that have been involved in OWASP for a while, I don't know if anybody remembers Tiffany Long. She was running like the OWASP community outreach at the time, and they were having a women in AppSec panel at this conference. And Tiffany asked me, she said, like, hey Dan, would you be in a position where you could like moderate this panel for the women in AppSec? And I unfortunately had to respectfully decline. I couldn't. It was right after my talk, and I didn't want to have to Heisman people running out of my talk to go and moderate this panel. But I had kind of two thoughts. Like, number one, I thought like that would be really valuable for me. I wish I had the opportunity to do it. Because it's an opportunity for me to ask questions and learn things. But also I told her, I was like, well, Tiffany, like what message does this send, right? Like women in AppSec, very important, right? And this Women in AppSec panel is a critical part to the success of this Belfast AppSec conference. So to make sure that nothing goes wrong, we're going to put in charge of it a cis straight white guy to make sure that this goes off without a hitch, right? And she's like, okay, I see your point. Yeah, maybe we need to do, we'll find somebody else to manage it, right? But just kind of in closing, like security is so important. If you look at the way technology is woven into modern society, everybody's lives, we have to make it work for everyone. And this is a marathon, not a sprint. The adage is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Like in security, we've got a long way to go. And so again, I'm happy that I've been able to make some progress in my thinking, and hopefully this puts folks in a situation to ask some questions as well. So thank you all.